Masechet Nedarim Daf Nun Chet. We began yesterday with an interesting question of this farmer Yishmael, who came with a question to Rabbi Ami. He came with a question in his hand, maybe even came with an onion bulb in his hand. And the question is, he has this onion that first grew during a Sheviit year. So therefore the onion would have Kedushat Sheviit. Kedushat Sheviit, if it grows in the wild and was not cultivated, then it's still permitted, but it has many restrictions on it. So essentially, the onion in its original form would have Kedushat Sheviit. But then he replanted it in the 8th year, and it grew a lot in the 8th year from that original bulb. And now we have something that has an original bulb of Sheviit, Kedushat Sheviit, but with further growth, more majority of growth. In the 8th year, and 8th year is totally permitted. And his question is, what is the status? Can we say that the new growth from the 8th year will nullify the Kedushat Sheviit and make it into an entirely new plant that is totally permitted? Or not? Is the original part of it still have Kedushat Sheviit? All right, really good question. It relates to ta'aruvot, things with mixtures. It relates to, as we said before, stem cells and things that you grow from artificial meat. All right, so now we already saw a couple of answers. Yishmael originally asked the question to Rabbi Ami. He didn't have it in his hands. He didn't know an answer. And so he goes to Rabbi Yannai. Rabbi Yannai says, I have an analogy. The same law regarding Terumah is permitted. If you plant Terumah, it grows further, the whole thing is permitted. So he says, go for it. Should be the same law for this. But then the Gemara challenged Rabbi Yannai. He's the one that brought this statement of Rabbi Yannai and said, Rabbi Yannai, how can you rely on the single opinion of Rabbi Yannai, who permits an onion that you replanted that was Terumah, and say now it's permitted, and therefore now it's going to be permitted for the Yishmael's question as well? How can you rely on the single opinion when we have two other opinions that prohibit? And then we cited the two prohibitive opinions. Rabbi Yohanan, he's not talking about Sheviit. None of them are actually talking about Sheviit. So there may be differences between these laws and Sheviit laws, which we're going to come see in a few minutes. Now, Rabbi Yohanan is talking about an orla branch that you graft onto a tree, and it says that if that orla branch had fruit, the fruit remains prohibited, even if it grows a lot more afterwards. We do not say that the new growth nullifies the original growth. So, same thing with Sheviit, it would be prohibited. Then we quote Rabbi Yonatan that says an onion that you put in a vineyard, that causes kilayim. Even if you take away the vineyard, and then the onion grows more, and the more that grows is permitted, it does not nullify what was there originally. And so here again, the new does not nullify, the new permitted stuff does not nullify the original onion bulb that was prohibited. And so we have now two opinions that say it's prohibited. All right, then we saw one more statement yesterday. Yishmael goes back to the Rabbi Ami, and Rabbi Ami says, hold on, I know you have two negatives against one. I put all the prohibitions in red here, and the one that say permitted in green. But Rabbi Ami says, I have another statement by Rabbi Yohanan himself that says onions that are planted, you have to take maaser from them. Even though they grew more, still got to go back and take maaser from the original, which means that the new growth does nullify the old growth. In this case, the original onions, or you already took maaser from them, and then you replanted them, and it grows more, and it says you have to take maaser. Obviously, from the new growth, you have to take maaser, because that's all new. But even have to take maaser again from the old growth. What we see here is that the new growth nullifies the status of the old growth. Looks like a good proof, but then we rejected it because this is actually for stringency. So for stringency, maybe we say, well, if the new growth is more stringent, and here it is, because now it requires maaser, then we'll follow the new growth, will nullify the permitted status that the old growth had. So we know we'll follow the new growth for stringency, but there's no proof from here that we'll follow the new growth for a leniency to say that the entire thing is like 8th year fruit and undoes the Sheviit. And so we leave off without a proof from Rabbi Ami. And so we're going to try a few more. We're going to see one prohibitive source, because that's Sheviit. It's from Sheviit itself, is not batel, but we'll reject this because it's also stringent. And then we'll see an attempted permissive proof from about onions that sprout on the ground in the 8th year, but we're going to reject that because maybe they're crushed. And then we're going to have a final proof that is going to be accepted, that weeding with suspected Jew after Sheviit is permitted. And so because we conclude that it is permitted, we're going to go back and say, hold on, this is a challenge to Rabbi Yohanan and Rabbi Yonatan, who said it was prohibited. And we're going to answer that actually Shemita is different from orla and kilayim, and so therefore they were talking about orla and kilayim. That's where it's prohibited. But for Shemita, in fact, it will be permitted. The new growth will permit the old growth. That's where we're going to leave it, at least for today. So let's go to this proof from Sheviit. Here we go. Ela min hada tetanya Rabbi Shimon Omer. כל דבר שיש לו מתירין כגון תבל ומעשר שני והקדש וחדש לא נתנו בהם חכמים שיעור. Okay, it's not clear from the following baraita where exactly the proof is from. There's a lot of different opinions and different interpretations of it. I'm going to try to give more or less straightforward one without too many ukimtot that some of the Rishonim give. Okay, so this is, here we start with a braita of Rabbi Shimon that gives a very important principle, has many applications. That's something that something that if you wait enough time, it will become permitted. For example, tebel. Tebel is regular produce that you didn't take to the maaser. If some tebel gets mixed up in a mixture of other food that's kosher food, then it's the davar sheyesh lo matirin, because this tebel is something that's prohibited now, but it can be made to be permitted by taking to the maaser. So you could take to the maaser, right, from that, or you could take from other produce for that if it fell in. And so since you can make it permitted, there's no point on relying on bitul, on nullification, right? Even if it's 1 in 1,000, don't rely on that. Just fix it, and then it'll be better. Similarly, maaser sheni. Maaser sheni is prohibited now if you're living outside of Jerusalem, but it's easily made kosher. Maaser sheni is what the owner takes to Jerusalem. So if you have some maaser sheni, it's prohibited now. Let's say it gets mixed into a mixture, and now the whole thing is, now you don't know. I can't eat it in Tel Aviv because it's maaser sheni. Well, simple solution. I'm not going to rely on bitul to say it's mixed in 1 in 1,000. Instead, take the mixture and go to Jerusalem and eat it there. Or you can redeem it for money. How much fell in there, right? $10 worth? So redeem it for $10. Take the $10 to Jerusalem and buy some food there. Since it's fixable, we don't rely on bitul. Hekdesh, something that you made hekdesh, no problem. Redeem it for its value, and then give the money to hekdesh. Or chadash. Chadash is something that before you take any grain before the second day of Pesach is prohibited. So if some grain that's chadash gets mixed in, and now it gets mixed in with kosher food, yashan or whatever, anything that's kosher, don't permit it. Just wait. All right, wait till the chadash becomes yashan after the second day of Pesach, and then it will be permitted. So in all these cases, lo natu bahem chachamim shiur. The rabbis did not give a minimum amount that says, if it's only a little that falls in, like 1 in 60, then it's permitted. No, the chachamim are not going to give you a leniency. This applies, by the way, to chametz on Pesach. Chametz on Pesach is not batel, not even 1 in 1,000. Why? Because just wait. You can wait till after Pesach, and then it becomes permitted. That's one of the reasons anyway. Okay. V'chol davar sheyeh en lo matirin kegon teruma utrumat maaser v'chala ve'orla v'kila kerem natnu behen chachamim shi'or. On the other hand, the Bishman is continuing to give his principle. Anything that will not become mutar, something that's prohibited forever. You can give simple examples like pig, or non-kosher meat. But other examples too, like teruma. Once something is designated as teruma, it's prohibited for a non-kohen forever. There's nothing you could do about it. Or teruma that that comes from maaser, which also goes to a kohen. If you're making dough, you separate challah, it belongs to a kohen. It's prohibited for everybody else. Or the lan, the first 3 years of a tree, is prohibited. That's prohibited forever. Those fruits are prohibited no matter how long you wait. Kilayim is also prohibited forever, and therefore, since no matter how long you wait, it's going to be prohibited. If a little bit of terumah falls into a lot of kosher food, then the rabbis did give a shiur and said, "Oh, look, a little bit shouldn't make a lot." Prohibited, and therefore the rabbis gave a determination of an amount that will be sufficiently small that we say it's batel. This formulation, by the way, is very interesting because it suggests that it's the chachamim that gave permission for these things. They gave a leniency. On a deoraita level, you might say, what does it mean bitul? If there's something prohibited in there, it's like poison. If a little bit of poison falls into something, still not going to eat it. But Chachamim came and gave a leniency that if there's no taste, if it's no taste or majority, depending on what type of prohibition it is and whether it's dry or wet, there's different ratios. But if the ratio is very small, sufficiently small, then the rabbis gave permission. Well, they gave permission because these things are never going to become allowed. But if it's going to become allowed, then what's the point of giving a leniency? Just wait, and then you don't have to rely on the bitul. Okay, all that makes sense. Now, here is, I think, where the question is coming from Chachamim. Amru lo, halo Sheviit and la matirin, velo natnu b'Chachamim shiur ditnana Sheviit oseret kol shehu bemina. Look at Sheviit and things that grow. Things that you plant during Sheviit, that's prohibited, or things that grow on Sheviit after the time of biur. Biur means you're allowed to eat things that grow on their own during Sheviit, right? But it's hefked. You can't hoard it. Even if you own the field, you can't go and collect a lot in your house. So you can collect some in your house and eat it as long as there's sufficient stuff in the field that everyone else can take also. But once it runs out in the field, there's no more, then anything that's in your house, you have to do biur, you have to get rid of it, you have to send it out and share it with everyone or burn it. Okay, so things, Sheviit, food, whatever restrictions we're talking about, is something that, en la matirin, no matter how long you wait, something that grows on Sheviit has the restriction of Sheviit forever, even in the 8th, 9th year. If you keep it around, it's still prohibited. And so even though this is something that en la matirin, still it's not batel. How do we know? Because Mishnah Sheviit says Sheviit is prohibited if it's kol shu bemina, if it's the same. If it's the same type, then it does not become nullified. And so you see, Rabbi Shimon, we have a contradiction to your rule, because Sheviit, even though it does not become permitted any time, it does not get nullified. So he answers, Oh, when I said my rule, I was only talking about biur. In other words, even Sheviit does have a time when it's permitted. When? Before the time of biur, meaning when there's still a lot in the field of that particular vegetable, and then I can keep some in my house, right, and eat it. And so that is the time when Sheviit is permitted. So actually, it is something that yeshlam matirin. It actually is permitted. In this case, the permitted time is actually before the prohibited time, but nevertheless, it is a permitted time. And so that's what I was talking about. If that becomes mixed into something else, so in that case, I would say, don't say it's batel and I can keep it even after the time of biur. No, right now it's permitted, so eat it now. And don't wait till biur comes and rely on bitul. So that's why I say it is actually, Sheviit is within the category of davar sheyesh lo matirin, and that's what this Mishnah was talking about when it says that it is not batel. But for eating it, let's say it did something that was prohibited because of Sheviit after the time of Bi'ur, got mixed into something else. Well, then it's no longer has as something that has matirin, and then I would say it does benoten ta'am, as long as there's no taste in it, it would be nullified. So Rabbi Shimon justifies his principle, and it works even for Sheviit. Okay, where's the question from? Some say the question is from Rabbi Shimon. I'd rather say the question is from Rabbanan. Better to ask from Rabbanan. And here the Rabbanan are saying Sheviit has no nullification. Now, even though here we're talking about a question of ta'arovet, of mixture, it seems that this question is making an analogy between mixtures and the bulb growing more. Just like a mixture is some prohibited Sheviit thing, and then it gets mixed in with kosher food, and according to the Rabbanan, there's no nullification, right? The whole thing is going to be, even a little bit of Sheviit and 1,000 of permitted food, the whole thing is going to be prohibited. We're making an analogy from there to an onion that's from Sheviit, even though it's a small onion, and it grows. I replanted in the 8th year, the Yishmael's case, and it grows a lot more. It's also going to be prohibited. And so wouldn't this be a good proof, according to Rabbanan, that it would be that there's a prohibition? And we reject this proof. This is Vidilma Haname Lechumra Shane. Maybe here also we're going for stringency. The case of Ta'arovet is where some prohibited Sheviit food gets mixed in, and so we say, you know what, we have to be stringent about this. But maybe this stringency only applies to a mixture, Ta'arovet. Maybe it's not the same as new growth. New growth is a different concept altogether. We have the bulb, but now it grew more, and so maybe that transforms the entire structure. It's a new vegetable, basically, that became replanted, a new growth. So it's not exactly a question of bitul, and so maybe we should be lenient and distinguish between something that is a ta'arovet and something that's bitul. Okay, that's one way to interpret this. Others try to make reinterpret this whole source to be talking about a bulb that you are planting in the 6th year to the 7th year, but it really doesn't say anything about that. Okay. Elamin hada pishataha. So, in the end, we say this, we reject this proof, and we're going to attempt to prove that something should be permitted from the following case. Ditnan. Besalim shirdu alehem geshamim vesamchu. Im hayu alin shelahen shechorin asurin horiku mutarin. You had some onions from the 6th year. So those are permitted onions. And now you put them on the ground. You're just storing them on the ground. And rain falls on them. And the rain makes them grow more. But that happens on the Sheviit year. So any new growth is going to be prohibited. So we want to know now, what do we do with this onion? So we check it. If the leaves are dark, shachor here doesn't mean black, it just means like they're dark green, which means they're fresh, they recently grew, then that means these recent growths happen on Sheviit, and therefore they are certainly prohibited. However, if the leaves are light colored, that means they're withered away, and that means they are old leaves from the 6th year that withered, and that means there was not new growth, and the whole thing is permitted. Okay, now Rabbi Hanania ben Antignos Omer, Im yecholin litalesh be'alin shelahen asurin, uchnegdan lemosa'eh Sheviit mutarin. He has a slightly different test to see if they're new or old leaves. He says if you can uproot the whole thing, if you pull up the leaves and the whole thing comes with it, then that means those are fresh leaves because they're strongly attached to the rest of the onion. Since they're new, that means they grew on the 7th year, and therefore they are prohibited. And the same is true if the onion originally grew in the 7th year, and then you put it on the ground and it rained on it after Sheviit in the 8th year, and you pull on it and the whole thing comes with it, well then you know that those new growths grew on the 8th year, right? Because they're strong leaves. And in that case, the whole thing is permitted. There we go. Now we have a proof. Here we have something that's the same case as Yishmael's original onion bulb. We have an onion that was originally grew in the 7th year, and put it on the ground, and it went to more growth on the 8th year. If we can prove that there's more growth on the 8th year by doing the pulling the leaf test, and the whole thing comes along with it, and that proves that this new growth is from the 8th year, then the whole thing is permitted. So there you go. The new growth nullifies the old growth, and the whole thing is permitted. So this seems like a good proof, but we have a problem with it. Are you telling me that this means that new growth permit the prohibited original bulb? That's what you're trying to say? Maybe not. Maybe this was crushed. Maybe that original onion, you pounded it and crushed it and put it on the ground. And so it was no longer a food item in its original state. It was all crushed and neutralized already by being crushed, and not because of the new growth. All right, well, maybe, so, but maybe not. So, but anyway, since it could be that, we can't prove from here. All right, El Amin Hadad Tanya, and so finally we reject this, and we're going to come up with our last and best proof. It's going to be about weeding, first with a Samaritan and then with a suspected Jew. Tanya. המנקש עם הכותי בחסיות, אוכל מהן אכילת ארעי ומסרין ודאי. You're weeding the field and of chasayot. Chasayot are things that we have bulbs like onions, so same thing. And the kuti, a Samaritan, he's not making sure to take to the maaser properly, so you can't trust him. Nevertheless, you can eat a temporary eating while you're doing that, because the law of maaser is that you only have to give maaser once you collect and pile up the fruit. You bring it in to the storage house. But if you're out in the field and you're just weeding, and so you're taking out some of them, so the rest of them will grow better. So then you can eat it in a temporary way without giving maaser. So it's permitted, therefore you don't have to worry about the Samaritan not taking maaser. You don't even have to take maaser yourself. Good. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, Im Yisrael chashud ala Sheviit, the maaser Sheviit mutar. Now, new law, this is what our proof is going to be from, that if there's a Jew who is suspected about Sheviit, but you're working with him after Sheviit. You're working with him in the 8th year together in this field, that even though you suspected him about the 7th year, but now it's the 8th year, and it's permitted. Now, how could it be permitted? Maybe some of the stuff here is from the 7th year. So, what do we see here? We see that we don't care if there were some bulbs of onions that were still around from the 7th year, because now I'm working on the 8th year, and it grew more in the 8th year. The new growth from the 8th year will nullify the prohibited onions from the 7th year. And so this would be a proof that, yes, the new growth permits the original old growth. All right, so this is a good proof. We're going to try to challenge it from a couple of places. Maybe we're talking about not onions, but rather other vegetables where the original seed is destroyed before the new growth comes about. Like we saw in the Mishnah yesterday, that made this distinction, like apples, apple seed that you plant. By the time the tree grows and there's new apples there's nothing left of the original seed. These are not outgrowths of the seed that's still there. It doesn't work, not like onions. So maybe we're talking about these other types, and that's the reason why the new growth is permitted, and I don't have to worry about the Sheviit. I don't have to worry about this farmer that I'm with, how he left Sheviit stuff there, because now I know anything that's growing now in the 8th year is totally fine, because these are things that came from seeds that were destroyed. No, I can't say that. We're talking about chasayot. We had that word. We already assumed it was talking about onions. And here's a proof that chasayot, what are chasayot? Arum, garlic, and onions. These are things that the seeds do not cease. By the way, here's an example of something that sprouts like a bean. And you see the bean, and by the time the new bean comes, the original is totally decayed. So we reject that rejection. So no, the proof is still good. Question number 2. Maybe we're talking about where the original bulb was smashed. Why would you smash it? Well, maybe because it's Sheviit, and so now this is time of biur, you have to destroy it. So you smash it, so it's not edible anymore. And so maybe it was all smashed already and not edible, and that's why this new stuff that grew from it is permitted. No, we're talking about a farmer who is not careful with Sheviit, so he's not going to go and make sure to smash all the leftovers of the onions. Why would he smash them? They're good. He will leave them. So that can't be the case. Maybe we're talking about Sheviit that was mixed in with other kosher food, and maybe that's why it's permitted. No, that can't be either, because we're talking about what you're weeding the garden. When you're weeding, you're out in the field and you're removing the weeds, and you're eating them as you weed, which is permitted, and so there's no opportunity for them to be mixed in, right? You're just consuming them immediately, and therefore this proof stands all of these 3 attempted rejections. So good, we had the original question from Yishmael. And we had a proof for, and then 2 against, but now we have a proof that is for. These three are rejected, and so now we come back with a proof that's for, and so this proof, together with Rabbi Yannai, we have a strong case. All right, so now with the strong case, we're going to go back and say, hey, Rabbi Yohanan, Rabbi Yonatan, this seems to be a rejection of your proof, because here this is based on the Braita. So lema tevet yubteh to Rabbi Yohanan to Rabbi Yonatan. So will this reject Rabbi Yohanan, Rabbi Yonatan, who said new growth remains prohibited? With new growth, the original remains prohibited. Amar Rabbi Yishmael, Shanya Sheviit, Oivisura al Yedek Karka, Betelata Name al Yedek Karka. Rabbi Yitzchak explains that Sheviit is not comparable to the other 2 cases, because in Sheviit, let's see here, the prohibition came because of the ground. The ground during the 7th year is holy, cannot be used. Cannot be planted. Everything is the hefked. It's Hashem's ground, and therefore the prohibition comes because of the ground, and so too the nullification also can happen because of the ground. So as long as this onion that was on Sheviit is replanted in the ground on the 8th year, so the nullification can happen through the ground. The prohibition came from the ground, nullification can come from the ground, so that works in Sheviit. It does not work in grafting, where the nullification, the prohibition of the Orla branch comes because of the law of Orla. It's the timing. It's not because of the ground that's holy. It's because the first 3 years of its growth. So that branch in itself is prohibited, and therefore replanting it or regrafting it onto something permitted is not going to help. The ground cannot help it in that case. And similarly, regarding an onion, this is in a video, this was kilayim. Here the prohibition is not because of the holiness of the ground, but rather because of the kilayim, because you put the onion next to vines, and that's what made it prohibited. And therefore, replanting it in the ground is not going to help you. The replanting in the ground can only help with Sheviit, where the prohibition came from the ground. Okay, so that's very interesting conceptual difference. And this is going to be accepted. We're just going to first clarify, hold on, what about maaser? Doesn't maaser also come from the ground? That prohibition come from the ground? And so therefore should be nullified from the ground also. But we see that even though the obligation to take 1/10 comes from the ground, you cannot do bitul by replanting into the ground. We know this from the following Braita, the Tanya. Litra maaser tebel. What's maaser tebel? Is it maaser or is it tebel? This means it's regular produce that you already took maaser. So this is the maaser, it's maaser rishon, but you didn't take terumah yet. So it is maaser. It itself is all maaser. You have a whole liter of maaser, but you didn't take terumah, so it's prohibited. And then you replanted it in the ground, vishbicha, and it grew more, and it grew 9 times. So now you have in total 10 liters of produce. Chayevet b'maaser u'b'sheviit. You have to still take maaser, meaning take terumah, from that original leader, and it's also obligated in the laws of Sheviit. And so what do we see here? The new growth, which if it is during a Sheviit year, meaning even on the Sheviit year, you still have to take maaser. On the Sheviit year, everything is hefker, open to everyone. So you don't have to take maaser on the new growth, because it's Sheviit year. Nevertheless, this Baraita says you do have to still go back and take terumah from the original leader that you replanted into the ground. Now how are you going to do that? It's in the ground. You have to figure out, and you'll take from a different place the proper amount, the proper ratio of what you put into the ground originally. What do we see from here? That maaser, even though it had a prohibition of tebel, because you didn't take terumah, even though you replanted it into the ground, and now it grew, and the new growth is no longer has a problem of terumah, and nevertheless it does not nullify the obligation for terumah of that which was already planted. And so we see here maaser or terumah that comes the prohibition comes from the ground, and yet the replanting in the ground does not nullify it. So this goes against the principle we just said. We answer, no, regarding maaser, the ground does not make it obligated to take maaser, but rather piling it up, right? Maaser, when something grows in the ground, just because it grew, I don't have to take maaser yet. Even though I harvested it, I don't have to take maaser yet, right? We saw before you could eat from it temporarily out in the field without taking maaser. When does the obligation kick in? Only when I pile it up for storage. And then the maaser kicks in. So you see, the ground does not make it prohibited, but the piling up makes it prohibited. That's why the replanting it is not going to help, and that is different from Sheviit, where the prohibition comes from it being grown in the ground. So what we see in the end is that all the other examples that we have of prohibition, which is maaser, the grafting orla branch, kilayim, those are all independent prohibitions independent of the ground. In those cases, replanting and further growth is not going to help the nullify the original. Only for Sheviit, because its original prohibition comes from the ground, when you replant it in the ground in the 8th year, that replanting, now when it has new growth, the new growth can overpower the original and nullify the original Sheviit prohibition. Baruch Adonai L'olam, Amen ve'amen.